Hey guys, and welcome to Studio Time Season 4, the very first episode. And in this episode, I'm gonna talk to you regarding the main theme of Justice League. It comes back in various iterations, but the thing that I want to show to you is a track that's called A Crew at WARPOWER, and that is the track that we release as the very first single. So, this particular track, I'm very happy with, and it was actually not the first version of the theme that I wrote, because Zack said to me when we were talking about the Justice League theme, he said to me, give me a national anthem. Why not? So that gave me a few headaches. So actually I wrote a different version of the theme first, which I will talk about in a separate video. But this is one of the scenes that happens in the movie, and it happens towards the end. So, Crew at WARPOWER, you can imagine what it means. It's like the whole gang is together and they are kicking ass. I want to talk about this theme and the things that went into it. The melody and the harmonic progression is similar and the same in this theme as the original theme that I wrote for this, which is called Justice League main theme. And so, like I just said, I'll talk about it in a separate video. So, now I want to play this theme. As you probably have heard on the release of the single when it came out a couple of weeks ago. And so what I'm playing to you right now is actually my demo. So this is not with the live orchestra, this is my Cubase session playing the demo. And so the orchestra is artificial, or in other words, fake. Let's see here, we see here strings, we see brass, we see a lot of different things. So I'm gonna play this, and then after that I'm just gonna talk you through it, what the melody is, what the harmony is, some sound design things that I did, some of the rhythms that I used, and obviously I need my red glasses. So you remember the old studio times, I have one pair of glasses, now I have two. So my eyes are getting worse because I'm getting older. So these are the computer glasses, which are red. And then these are my reading glasses, and now I see shit. So now I'm putting the red ones on, and ta-da, I can actually see Cubase. But I have these at hand in case my phone is ringing or I need to send an email. Enough with that bullshit talk. Let's just go to the Crew at WARPOWER. Let me play this thing, and then we'll talk about it. And there you have it, ladies and gentlemen, the crew at WARPOWER in a demo version. So when I was playing back, I showed you a few plugins that I'm using on the processing front. In this, we see LFO Tools here, which is really great plugin. So you can create your own LFO shapes, gating, whatever you want to do, key input compression emulation. It's really great. Some bit crusher on the bass and the cello, actually, I used it. And the decapitator, which is really great, warm sounding distortion. I use that twice, and some autopan that goes ridiculously fast back and forth. Just to name a few plugins that I was using for this particular track. I use many, and especially when things are part of my own sample library, as being part of my template, my own drums, my own bass guitars, things like that. They have so much processing already built into the sample when I was mixing it, so I don't usually have to do all that much. So for very clever observers, they might have noticed that for this particular score, I still used my old brass library, because the brass library came out, almost like a little over a year ago, but I simply had no time to build a whole new template with the new brass in it and getting rid of older libraries. But now it is in the template, so there's going to be videos about the Junkie XL brass and the new template and what is new and what was thrown out. So separate video regarding that. Okay, so let's start with the orchestra a little bit. So when we have a section, let's see, can I find it? Yeah, it's here. It's when that bass riff starts, which is really a combination of a live bass guitar, but with basses and cello playing at the same time. So let me play you that riff here. Now I'm going to switch solo on. Here we go. I have a hanging note. I'm sure that happens again, but I have a massive button here that says Reset MIDI that will shut everything up. It even shuts up my dog. It has a link to my dog. He stops barking just like that. Okay, here we go. The riff. So I doubled that with a live bass guitar, and these are samples, but when this was recorded live in London, it had so much grit in the live basses and the cello, and it made it super aggressive, and that was the sound that I was going for. So I usually try to write in such a way that short strings and long strings do not overlap, in a sense that there is a long cello part and there's a short cello part, so it can be played with everybody at the same time. Here though, you see some short notes on the strings being played as well as long notes here. So what I actually did for this particular movie was that I sampled the program strings and did some really intense processing on it, which is replacing altogether this string part. So, and then it gets a thicker voicing. So it's very short, very tight, and so I didn't want this to be played live. It was my intention to resample this and do some really crazy stuff with it. We'll get to it later, what I did with it, when we get to the electronic side of things. So as the bass riff is playing and these short, higher strings are playing, I'm now bringing in some dramatic movement in the long strings. So let's see what that sounds like. And we're looking now at the short strings, and at the same time we're looking at the long strings as well. For regular viewers, they know that my resampled library of cinematic strings is my preferred library of choice, so we hear it right here. So what you see is that the viola barely drops below the C3, and all the strings are happening on top, with then the basses playing in octaves with the cello almost like 2 octaves apart. And the reason why I did that is that that hole that we see right there is primarily being filled by the brass. So what I had to keep in mind with Justice League, and this is a very handy tip not to create like a muddy arrangement, is that if you do a hybrid score like this is, you got to think about what you're going to hybride it with. So if you're going to hybride it with distortion basses and with lots of percussion and with synthesizers in the lower register, that's primarily all happening in the bottom of the screen. So the orchestra then gets, or the strings in this case, gets a feature above C3, and in that area I'm not mixing it a lot with sound design or electronic elements, so it's very clear that what is happening in that area is the orchestra, and everything below is a mix with a massive hole left by the strings to be filled up by cool arpeggios or bass riffs that go up and down in octaves. So that whole space is available for the brass and for the synthesizer elements. If we look, for instance, at the choir, you see a similar thing. So you see here like female sustain lacrimosa, and you see that also here, I'm not really dropping below the F2, which if I were to use the males at the same time that go way lower, I would potentially interfere with electronic elements there, and it would create a very, very muddy sound, and I don't want to do that. The other thing that I keep in mind is when I program something for choir, so by no means is this a perfect choir arrangement, for instance, because the choir in Justice League has a quality of color. It's not a quality of feature, if that makes any sense. So it's not like Carmina Burana, where the choir is like the predominant source of what you hear, or some of these really other amazing choir pieces. It's purely a color. So if I now open this up at the same time with, for instance, the long strings, I usually do this at the same time. So let me make this a color that is different. So let's make this color, for instance, blue. And then we open up the strings and the choir. So now you see that the blue is the choir, and it pretty much follows what the strings in that same region are doing as well. So I usually check the different instruments against each other, so to make sure that I'm not creating unnecessarily or unwanted clashes. And if the clashes are there, those are the clashes that I like. But it's always good when you're done with an arrangement to check the woodwinds against the brass, to check the brass against the strings, and then the strings against the woodwinds, and then everything at the same time with the choir. Or, and most people forget that, to check it against the electronic elements. So for instance, if I now were to, for instance, take my my bass part here, the acoustic bass part of the orchestra, and I would go, for instance, here to a program bass guitar, and I open them up at the same time, you see that you don't see any overlap. So in the lower frequencies, you never want an overlap. So if I now go to the basses, you see everything turns red, but nowhere in the arrangement are you seeing a blue and a red note playing at the same time, but with a half note apart, or a third apart, or a fourth apart. So it stays like really tight and unisono in the bottom octave. I usually try to avoid like lower voicings anyway in the orchestra in an action score, unless it's like an effect, you know, just like for instance the famous John Barry chord progression, you know, Goldfinger, and then especially when he does the multi chords, like the two major sevenths being part of it. It's such a musical chord progression, but at that point in time in his score, there were no synthesizers playing in that same octave. The same as, for instance, on Black Mass, I had a dark voicing that went. So when you're just listening to a string ensemble, very brooding, that can be an amazing color to have, you know, these brooding voices in the bottom. Or if you have like 5 basses playing a cluster. There's nothing more beautiful than that. But in an action score with synthesizer basses, with strong rhythms, with a big heroic theme, I usually tend to play the first 2 octaves in unison, and before I start playing harmonies, it's usually above that. So in an action score, to have these low voicings, when a rhythm is hammering at the same time with basses, usually not a great idea, especially if it's mixed with like low voices in the brass, low voices in the male squires. So I usually try to avoid that. So that is about that. Let's focus on the theme itself, which is featured in the strings here. Let's go to that section. Here we go. So we hear the staccato strings playing on the bottom, and so they play now that riff that we heard, but now it's being transposed and altered to fit with the harmonic progression. And so the same thing happens in the bass guitars, obviously, as well. So let's play a little bit of that. So here we see the same thing. So it's played in harmony with a little counter line, and the main melody is an octave pretty much all the way through. There's a big gap here as well in the arrangement. So if this were a string-only piece, this would probably not be your ideal arrangement, but we're talking about a hybrid score here. So if I unmute everything else that's playing at the same time, and now I'm playing this section again. So now you can hear very well how that big hole there is being filled by the thundering drums, by brass voicings and some sound design and those aggressive bass guitars. So, and there's actually some guitar lines in there as well. So that really fills that space there where the strings are not happening. So now the feature is really for the strings, and so you could hear them even better. That same thing happens also in the brass. So if we look at the brass, we see somewhat the same philosophy where the bottom two octaves are always playing more or less the same thing, except for that little thing here where it does that jump. So it gets there, but so in this case, I actually use the minor third there because it's part of the melody in octaves. So the brass arrangement is pretty straightforward here, also keeping in mind that there are way more things playing at the same time. So if I play this little bit here. So the section where I just stopped, you see that again, it almost feels like a two-finger exercise, right? Where the goes. And the melody just like play da 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 da. Again here's a massive hole where the cello and the basses are playing da 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 dum da dum 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 da 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 dum da 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 dum 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 da 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 dum da 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 dum. So if I were to open, for instance, the bottom brass with, for instance, the cello and the basses, now you can see that. So that's why I left that room there. So this thing. This thing here can be heard, because if I would have prolonging notes there in brass by the trombones, it's going to mask that riff and it will be way less audible. So again, that's why I created that hole there. But again, if we play this particular section where I just stopped, let's see, right here. But now, so first I'm going to play it solo where it sounds so naked. Okay, so now I'm going to go out of solo. So now you can hear that area that sits underneath is really filled with samples and with electronic programming that fills up that space. And if I would have arranged it fully for the trombones, I would lose the riff from the cello and the bass guitar potentially, and the other electronic elements that go in the middle, and of which the drums is a very important part. So if your drum rhythms are a really important part in your music, especially this type of music, you want to make sure that you create space for it. It's going to be hard to slap it on top of like a perfectly orchestrated string brass piece on its own, but now you add a lot of programming, and that's where a lot of people that send me music, they run into issues because they arrange something perfectly for the orchestral world first, and then they want to know how to add electronic elements to it. And I would always ask them, but what are you going to take out to make space for it? And so it's very important. I mean, if you want like a walking bass in the lower octave, you cannot have really strong 1-bar, 2-bar notes, because it's going to mess everything up. So that's why that is important. You should definitely try it when you work on a next piece of music again and see what you think of it. So one thing I wanted to point out, which is a very predominant harmony in Justice League, which is the minor major 7 harmonic chord. And so it's a C, G, C, G, and there we go. The B is in the C minor chord. And so we hear that a lot through Justice League, especially with the Batman's theme. So that comes back a couple of times. There's a separate episode on the Batman theme and the bat signal and everything. It comes back a lot in the theme for Darkseid, the Mother Box, and Steppenwolf, and it comes back in the Justice League theme. So it's a harmony that is reoccurring. And the other thing that's reoccurring is the half step, whole stop, half step in the bottom end of the octave. So that note progression. It only happens in the bottom octave, so not as much in the upper octaves. We'll get to that separately, but I just wanted to point out this particular chord because it happens here over that bass riff where the horns are playing the opening melody for the Justice League crew when we hear this chord coming in. It happens there and it happens here again, I think. Again, that minor major 7 chord. The reason why people think, oh, that sounds familiar. Well, there is a minor major 7/9 chord, which is the James Bond chord. So that is a C, a G, A flat, B, the D. Beautiful, beautiful harmony. Extended harmony, really great. So let's look at some of the electronic aspects. Let's see. Well, first, the rhythms. Never get tired of rhythms. You know, you guys know that. Okay, so let's play what the drum rhythms sound like, for instance. So that's like a, you know, everything MIDI programmed. And if I am not mistaken, I did do some resamples of that. And here we go. So I would record like all the 2-pans and surdos in, and then I would put a plugin on top of it to give it even more bite than it already has. Usually what I do is I'm trying to find this track right here. And are we there? No. Because my mixer window and arrange window is not synced, but now it is, and boom, here it is. So there is a decapitator on top, and as you can see here, I roll off the lower frequency. So what we're left with is the mids and the highs. And if I were to record in the surdos and two pans as they were, do some processing and mix it with it, I might run into phasing issues because of the same samples being triggered. So what I usually do is I transpose this up or down. So for instance, if we solo this and we play this, let me deactivate the plugins. So here we go. So you hear I already transposed it. You can see it up there in the screen. It says transpose 3. So if I were to go down to 0, this would be our natural two-pan sound. So now transpose 3. And you hear you get that really weird effect of transposing and time stretching at the same time, because what happens is if you transpose, it would technically run faster. And so to counter the fact that it's running faster, it has an algorithm built in that it keeps it at the original tempo. We can do really crazy transpose, like 2 octaves. But this is a really great way to do sound design. And so so if you transpose it up, you get a really interesting quality to it. And now I switch the capitator on, and so you could really add like a nice quality of bite to it. So if I go to a section where the drums is playing, so let's take these puppies, solo these, and let's mix this track in. So I'm going to take this off read, so, and it's also muted at this point. So. So you hear the two-pan surdos original, and then I'm fading in that processed sound. But we can go way extremer, you know, just like, you know, let me show you what it sounds when it's like 9 semitones up. The results are really interesting, depending on what you're looking for, obviously. Interesting, right? So, but the same effect happens when you go lower. It also really cool sound effect. I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to bring up my fader again. Hello, fader. Okay, here we go. So I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to mix it in. So this is a really interesting trick to play with resamples and do some interesting processing to it, not like completely take it out of context, but just mixing it back in to create like more punch or more aggression. Obviously, you can do this with synthesizers too. Let's see, did I... where is my crazy string riff? And I can't seem to find it. Here it is. Oh, so these are some of the string riffs that I did. Here we go. The ones that I talked about earlier, remember, you know, the quick programming. So these are really weird sound design versions of that same thing. So for the life of me, I don't know what I did. This is like the rendered audio. But usually what happens is like I take like bits of audio and then late at night I just load them up on my laptop. I have Cubase on this laptop as well, and then I play with things, or I play with sound design programs, or stretching it, resequencing it. I do this a lot, and I have so much fun doing it. So almost every track has a little bit of that in it. So let's see what else is interesting about this track. It's actually, there is not so much in this track as you might think. There's a lot of percussion. Here are all the bass sounds. Oh yeah, one of the bass sounds that I sampled this instrument for Mortal Engines, and I did use it, but in Justice League, it was the bass guitar to go for. It's so brutal. So when I was in Wellington, New Zealand, I said to Peter Jackson, it's like, I love to sample like some crazy instruments. And he said, oh, why don't you use the big hall next door? And so there was like a big place that used to be something like a Home Depot, you know, for non-American friends. It's like a big department store to buy tools and lumber and metal and paints, but completely empty. So the reverb in that room was insane. And I put, for the bass, I put a massive Ampeg bass amp in there, and I had a couple of different bass guitars and distortion pedals. So I sampled myself and built all these instruments from it. And boy, that stuff comes in handy when you need some cool sounds. It's like, oh wait, didn't I do that like 3 years ago? And there they were. So it's all over the score. So you will see a lot of this. In the sound design department is not really anything happening. One other very particular characteristic sound that you will hear also throughout the score, it's this thing. So for people that have seen earlier episodes, I call this instrument the piano from hell. I originally built it for 300 Rise of an Empire, and it's like you should Google the instrument, or maybe we can put a link, the making of the score for 300 Rise of an Empire. You see that piano that I built with like guitar pickups, and you brush it, you hit it with sticks, and so this is a sampler instrument that comes from that. The other instrument that I would call something similar, the guitar from hell, which is an acoustic guitar played with really weird sticks and stuff, and then do sound design on it, and that instrument sounds like this. So again, here you hear that mode of the tempo not changing, but the pitch is, and so you get that interesting side effect that we talked about earlier by transposing the drums up and down. So I did this with a program called Medicine, great sound design program. Let's see, some standard big hits. I'm sure you believe all that. Oh yeah, and the other interesting sounds that is used a lot throughout the score is really weird sound design done on choir. There will be a separate episode on Dark Side Steppenwolf and the Mother Boxes, which one of the singles I think was released like last Friday or something, with the Mother Box contest. So that is one of the shorter cues for Steppenwolf Dark Sides, but that obviously that music is playing a lot in the movie. So a lot of weird choir samples. So this is a choir sample that is more consonant and not so dissonant. Everything for Dark Side is very like trippy out there. So that gives you a little bit of an idea, like, you know, what cool stuff you can do with choir, you know, with sound design programs. So a lot of this sound design that you hear in this cue, but also as individual tracks in my template that I usually play, they're not necessarily made in Cubase as a sound design tool, but lots of different programs. There will be a separate episode on how to create sound design yourself if you've never really done it before. So I'm very happy with that episode, because I'm going to show you a couple of things that are so easy to do yourself with incredible results immediately. So that's a separate episode later in this season. So keep an eye out for that. And that is pretty much it for this track. I mean, there's some sub bass lines to make sure that there's enough bottom end. Let's see. Oh, this is an interesting sound. This is my big modular system when I still had it. I sold it. I didn't need it anymore. But I did terabytes and terabytes and terabytes and terabytes of recordings and sample chopping that I don't think I can score enough movies in this lifetime to use all those sounds. Unless I work harder, but I think I work hard enough. Yeah. So that is being used at a certain point in the crew of WARPOWER, but there's so many instruments like that, and yeah, it's just cool. Let's see, what is this sound doing? Great little sounds. So there's always like that little ear candy, like here and there. And ladies and gentlemen, that brings me to the end of episode 1, Studio Time, season 4, 5. Hisham, 4 or 5? 4. Season 4, I hear from the other room. Okay, guys, thank you so much for watching, I should say. And I hope to see you next week on episode number 2. See you then.